everyone, Clio here, and today I am doing a book talk, and it is a classics book talk because today we are talking about Don Quixote de la Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. Miguel de Cervantes y Saavedra, I think is the full name of the author, and so let's just dive into it. These book talks are kind of chaotic in the sense that I'm a chaotic person. I don't prepare videos or anything like that most of the time, and that means that I'm just going to be talking, and so there's possibly no rhyme or reason to the order in which I'm going to be doing this. But so, in terms of what I know about Don Quixote, there's not really that much that I know. So Don Quixote de la Mancha is a book that was published in two parts. And so the first part was published, I think, 1605 or something like that. And the second part was published 10 or 15 years later. So that is important going into it. And part of my criticism of Don Quixote is probably due to the fact that I read it just like in one whole. I read it like immediately after one another, and so part of my criticism that's going to be about the length of this thing is of course not really valid in that sense, because it wasn't really one whole. It was a book that was published in two parts. There's like 10 to 15 years in between those times, so for people who were reading it at the time that it came out, it definitely wasn't the case that they would read it in one go mostly. I do have the Spanish editions, and I did actually start out reading it in Spanish. However, after a while I started skipping over the Spanish edition and just listening to the English audiobook, because I do have knowledge of Spanish, but this is like an old version of Spanish. So it was kind of difficult for me to be able to follow. The structure of the sentence could be different, the way in which things were spelled. And so after a while I just no longer thought it was worth it for me personally, based on my experience with Don Quixote, the story, for me to put in that much time. So I did start it out in Spanish, but I in the end only consumed the translation for a big part of the story in itself. As can be inferred from that is that I did study Spanish, and so I did have classes on the history of Spain that will have had an impact on this story. I don't know too much about those classes anymore. The one thing that I did definitely think about while reading Don Quixote was the Arabs' invasion. So the Spanish peninsula was invaded by Arabs, I think a couple of times in the history of Spain, and so as a result also some Arab words made their way into the Spanish language, for example. And that definitely does play a role when it comes to the representation of Arabs within Don Quixote de la Mancha. Now, basics. What is the story about? So the story of Don Quixote de la Mancha is often referred to as the first modern novel. It is even referred to a lot of the times as the greatest novel of all times. And in it we follow our protagonist, who has dubbed himself Don Quixote de la Mancha. He is a big reader of chivalry novels, and he has imagined himself to be the protagonist of one of these stories. He imagines himself to be a knight-errant and wants to roam the country looking for adventures, looking for problems to solve, looking for damsels to save, looking for fame and recognition. Accompanying him on his adventures will be his squire, Sancho Panza, who is basically his neighbor, and the dynamics between is definitely what drives a lot of the story. However, their adventures almost always will land them into trouble, as Don Quixote is prone to take ordinary things that he comes across on the road and imagine them being something totally different. Like, he would see an inn and he imagines it to be a castle. Now, it's probably important to point out that my main problem with Don Quixote de la Mancha is its episodic nature. So I do think that there's a lot of things that are worthwhile in the story. There are a lot of things that have a lot of merit. However, the story is very much structured as a string of adventures, and these adventures for me definitely started to feel very repetitive or redundant after a while, and so I kind of wanted there to be more of an overarching story to it, or for us to have more overarching developments throughout, rather than, you know, what kept me kind of going through it is I want to kind of see what the conclusion at the end of the novel was going to be, what the author was driving the story towards. And I definitely feel like we could have done with a whole lot less adventures to get to where the story ended up going. So I don't necessarily think that I wasted my time reading this book, but did I get a whole lot out of it? No, that's not the case neither. So why call Don Quixote the greatest novel of all time? Now, I personally definitely don't agree with the statement of the greatest novel of all time, but I also haven't looked at the reason why people are calling it that. But I definitely can see that this novel will have played a huge role within literary developments, and that there are many things being done within this book that a lot of novels have since done after Don Quixote first did it. So first thing that I'm going to talk about is the meta level. I love books that talk about books. I love books that have some sort of a meta element to it, whether it is, taking us behind the creation of the book itself, whether it is addressing us as the reader specifically, whether it is referring to itself within the pages, all of those types of things I eat up, and this book does do those things. So the entire book of Don Quixote de la Mancha is kind of presented as a reworking of a text that is found by a previous author. So basically the stories of Don Quixote de la Mancha were written down at the time in which Don Quixote was alive himself, and the author of this work at this point in time is rewriting that text. And so we do have that sort of element to it because there is no original author, of course. Miguel de Cervantes is the original creator of this work. Apart from that, we will also be referring to Miguel de Cervantes at times within this book. For example, at the very beginning of this story, one of the neighbors of Don Quixote, when he realizes that Don Quixote has been driven mad from these chivalry novels, he goes through Don Quixote's library trying to see which one of these books does hold merit and which ones need to be burned. Yes, trigger warning for book burning. And one of the books that they come across is a book by Miguel de Cervantes. So they are discussing the merits of Miguel de Cervantes' works within a book by Miguel de Cervantes. Apart from that, later on within the book, Miguel de Cervantes will actually become a character himself. So at some point in time, there's a story within a story in which we're looking at some Spanish people who have been imprisoned by Arabs. And one of the other imprisoned Spanish people is called Saavedra, which is the second last name of Miguel de Cervantes. And Miguel de Cervantes actually was a prisoner of war at some point, so he is putting himself, his history, into this story as well. Apart from having references to the author himself, to Miguel de Cervantes himself, or having Miguel de Cervantes put fake authors within his work, we also do get Don Quixote de la Mancha, the book, present within the story itself. So at the start of the second book of Don Quixote de la Mancha, the first book has actually been published as well within the fictional world of Don Quixote de la Mancha. Meaning that when Don Quixote de la Mancha sets out on his adventures, people actually know who he is and they have read his adventures before. At the same time, in the second novel, the second novel of Don Quixote de la Mancha is also being published. However, the second novel of Don Quixote de la Mancha that is being published within this fictional story is a different book than the one that we are reading. So I do definitely like all those types of elements. I love the way in which it is playing with fiction and reality. It is blending those two in a story that is about a reader who can no longer distinguish between fiction and reality. So I absolutely love that element and that aspect to Don Quixote. And so whenever I stumble upon instances like that, that definitely put a smile on my face, definitely made me appreciate what Miguel de Cervantes was doing with his works. Another interesting aspect to this book is that it can raise questions of what is insanity, what is madness, what makes us say that somebody is insane, who has authority to call somebody insane or to call somebody stupid, for example, because stereotypically Don Quixote de la Mancha is presented as the madman and Sancho Panza is presented as the dumb man. Because whenever Don Quixote steps out into the world, he sees things that other people do not see. Where other people see a sort of like donkey, he will see a noble horse. Where normal people see a windmill, he sees giants, for example. But apart from the fact that Don Quixote is mad, Sancho Panza is considered stupid because he sees the windmill, he just sees it as a windmill. But whenever Don Quixote then explains that probably there are some enchanters who are making Don Quixote see the real thing and making Sancho Panza see something different, Sancho Panza accepts what Don Quixote is telling him. He goes along with Don Quixote's madness and is convinced by Don Quixote's reasoning. And so he is often considered to be the stupid man. He's considered to be simple because he goes along with whatever Don Quixote is telling him, and he believes what Don Quixote is telling him. However, what the story does throughout is kind of show us these instances of Don Quixote showing real wisdom, real clarity of vision, and maybe even having a better view of the world than people who would consider him mad. And so a lot of the times the text will refer back to the astonishment that people have upon meeting Don Quixote and talking to him, of realizing how profoundly intelligent, how profoundly wise Don Quixote can be, while at the same time having these fits of what they consider to be madness. And in parallel with Don Quixote and his madness, we see the same thing happening with Sancho Panza. We see the same thing happening when it comes to Sancho Panza in terms of his stupidity, because a lot of times he's shown to be very wise or to be very intelligent or to have a very unique, smart approach to the world, and at some point in time he actually has the possibility to be governor of a certain town, and everybody is astonished at how well he does at the very beginning of that adventure. Everybody's astonished at how smart the rules are that he wants to put in place in his government. And so throughout we will see this sort of play between madness. Is he mad or isn't he? Is he stupid or isn't he? Making us question what sort of criteria we use to determine whether somebody is mad or stupid or whatever of these things. Making us question the validity of these terms in the first place. Another thing that I definitely need to place within the plus pile for this book is Marcella's speech. So in the first part of Don Quixote de la Mancha, at some point our heroes are confronted or run into some boys who are lamenting the loss of their friend, who between the lines has committed suicide because the person that he loved didn't love him back, and so he became desperate over her rejection and he decided to take his own life. And so the story, the way in which that is told, is very much a sort of like blame fest against the woman. They're very much blaming her for her cold treatment, saying that she is somebody who steals the heart of all the young boys who meet her, and that she's cold, cruel, because she doesn't want to because she doesn't return their love. This is of course a book published within at the beginning of the 17th century, so it doesn't really surprise me to see this type of language there. But what definitely did surprise me is that Miguel de Cervantes then gives the word to Marcela, so to the young lady herself, and allows her to defend herself and allow her to say that she's under no obligation to return people's love. She shouldn't just feel love for somebody just because they love her. She needs to feel love herself as well. I did also like some of the other female storylines within this book, though definitely it is still a product of its time. It doesn't have huge female empowerment or anything like that, and it kind of does have, and it does definitely have these misogynistic elements to it. So even though we have Marcella's speech at the beginning, for example, there are reiterations later on within the book of this idea of the cruel women who spurn the attentions of males. So definitely not saying that because Marcella's speech is in there that there's no other instances of misogyny in there. There definitely are instances of racism in there. I think on the whole it is still contained considering the fact that the text is so lengthy. But as I said, some of the backgrounds to this time period is that we had those Moorish invasions, those Arab invasions, and so sentiments toward Arabs was definitely not very favorable at the time, and that is definitely clear within the text. Arabs are often presented as these sort of characters that you cannot trust, characters that are evil and those sort of things. And so even though the original author of Don Quixote de la Mancha is presented as being Arab himself, so the original document that Miguel de Cervantes is rewriting was written in Arab, in Arabic. How do you say that in English? You know what I mean. But so But even there, they do kind of refer to the fact that you cannot really trust the original manuscript because it is written by somebody who is an Arab. So there are definitely instances like that. There is definitely one instance that I've kind of forgotten fully what it was that was said in that chapter. But in the first book of Don Quixote, there is definitely a speech that Sancho Panza at some point makes in which he's talking about Arabs in a way in which that totally was not okay, and you know, my love for the character of Sancho Panza definitely was shot down at that moment in time. Later on, he kind of redeems himself in the sense that he no longer has any of these sort of problematic speeches, but that definitely was a scene in which I was like, yeah, this is definitely racism that we definitely don't condone. So there definitely are some elements of racism in there that you need to be wary of going into it. I think it is quite contained on the whole because there aren't that many Arab characters introduced into this story neither. So we are kind of going into the direction of my negatives with this here, of course, because I've now mentioned that there is some misogyny from time to time, that there is racism from time to time. My main criticism, as I said from the beginning, is the episodic nature. So especially at the very beginning, there was a huge emphasis on just like a sort of adventure, a chapter sort of structure. We do go past that sort of structure around chapter 22, I think, when we do start to get adventures that take on multiple chapters. And so around that time we also kind of start having instances of characters in his environment playing along in order to placate Don Quixote and get him to do what they actually want him to do. And that probably leads me to discuss like the main differences between books 1 and 2. Like, first of all, let me indicate that book 1 can be a standalone. If you just read book 1, you kind of have the full story in the same way that you would have if you just read book 2. I think just reading book 2 is just a little bit different because you don't have the sort of origin story of how did Don Quixote end up being mad, what is it that drove him mad. I think it's just kind of inferred or referred to within this book rather than you really having that exposition that you had of that in the first book. But I actually think I enjoyed book 2 more, and let me kind of talk about those elements. So in book 1, as I said, we start out with that sort of adventure per chapter structure that didn't really work for me. So we have Don Quixote setting out on his adventure. I think he sets out on an adventure 3 times within the entirety of the full story of Don Quixote, meaning he leaves his hometown 3 times. The first time he leaves alone, but that's a very short period of the book, and he is kind of beaten up by some guys, I think, over some things that he is saying, and then he returns back to the village, he recovers, and next time that he steps out, he does no longer do that alone, he does it together with Sancho Panza. And then the majority of this first book is their first big adventure, which is comprised of many short adventures, and the second time that they will leave their hometown is then the second book of Don Quixote de la Mancha. So in this first one we are looking at 2 times in which Don Quixote leaves his home village and goes in pursuit of his goal of being a world-renowned knight. So in that first book, as I said, we have that adventure per chapter structure that later does break down in a little bit more like longer adventures. Certain characters that we meet we will stay with for a very long time and are referred back to in multiple cases, but we also at that time do get a sort of structure of the overarching story, the overarching adventure taking place with Don Quixote and some of the people who are misleading him and who together with you as a reader have more information of what is playing on, of what is going on and what the goal is of the people around Don Quixote, but that is interspersed with stories within stories, stories within stories that kind of relate to the overarching story, but to some extent also just seem pointless. So that definitely kind of hindered my enjoyment. I like stories within stories, but we did get like 3 stories within story in quick succession. And so that was too much all at once, and that definitely took the pacing down for me. And so in terms of that first volume, I kind of feel like it is a little bit more of a mishmash of things. You know, you have that adventure of Don Quixote alone, you have those sort of like chapters you have those sort of like adventure per an adventure chapter structure, then you have the big overarching adventure, then you have those stories within stories. So it kind of feels a little bit too unstructured in that sense. It kind of feels a little bit too wishy-washy. Whereas the second book very much feels more like it has one overarching plot line, like it's really just, it doesn't go off into side tangents, it doesn't have these short adventures that don't really have any sort of purpose. It really does have a lot more of that overarching storyline to it. However, at the same time, I also couldn't be bothered anymore. What I definitely do think is an interesting difference between the first book and the second book is that whole idea of the publication of Don Quixote de la Mancha Part 1 within the story itself. So in book 1, so in part 1, whenever somebody would meet Don Quixote, they didn't know who he was. Don Quixote would always be like, I am the famous knight of Don Quixote, and everybody would look at him like, who? Who are you? They wouldn't know who he was. They would consider him to be kind of crazy based off of what he was telling them or based on what he was doing, and they would respond very negatively. So this book is also very interesting in that sense, in that it could be seen as a discussion of how we treat people with mental illnesses. So I think in the first book, Don Quixote is beat up almost every single chapter, for example. So it's definitely looking at the way in which people with mental illnesses are treated very poorly. And so within that first book, that is kind of basically always what we get. Don Quixote introducing himself, not getting the reaction he wants, you know, starting fights with everybody over things that they have said that he misinterprets, for example, and then them beating him up. So in the second book, Don Quixote has been enticed back home by people in his surrounding. He has been doing somewhat better when it comes to his insanity. It seems at times like he is getting back in touch with reality. However, he does at some point decide that he does want to step out into the world again. He wants to reclaim his position as knight-errant and become the famous knight Don Quixote again. So he and Sancho set out on another adventure. And so at that point we also do get somebody trying to get Don Quixote to return home again by playing along with his adventures. But we also do see some people who are, in my opinion, very toxic people who are introduced to Don Quixote, have read his stories, have loved his stories, and they take him into their home and they treat him very well. But they are also constantly playing along to Don Quixote's madness, trying to create schemes, setting up scenarios for Don Quixote to solve. And the reasoning for that is just so that they can get a laugh out of it. And that laugh often comes at the expense of physical harm to Sancho Panza, for example, or just of mental anguish to some of the characters. And so I definitely think that those characters are very toxic people, and that's also why I very much love the fact that Miguel de Cervantes did, towards the end of the novel, when we are returning with those characters, say at some point that, you know, isn't it madness itself to play along with mad people, to go along with the madness that you recognize in other people? And so we do definitely get a very different dynamic in the second book because of that whole idea that people who meet Don Quixote now know who Don Quixote is, now actually recognize his name. They already know what to expect of Don Quixote himself. And so while they're actually very much amused at meeting him and at seeing that he really is the way that he is represented in part 1, they do also start to kind of play along with him a little bit more within the second book that took place within the first one. Also, when it came to Don Quixote's madness and the way that his madness is presented, I definitely think that part 1 worked much better for me than part 1, because I definitely feel like in part 1 Don Quixote's madness is on a higher level than in part 2. So in part 1, when he sees an inn, he thinks the inn to be a castle, for example. He sees a regular maiden, thinks her to be a sort of like queen or a duchess or something like that, and so he will often be seeing something else in his mind than what is actually out there in reality, and that is creating a lot of the misconceptions, the sort of like adventures that ensue, and that's very much causing a lot of the problems for Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. But within the second one, we actually I don't think we ever have cases where Don Quixote is misinterpreting what is happening around him. His madness more comes from the fact that he keeps on holding on to his idea of him being a knight, his idea of the ideals of chivalry, and his idea that his loved one Dulcinea has been enchanted. And that where he knows his loved one to be a noble woman, she has presented herself to him as a simple country wench. And so actually within the second novel, a lot of the sort of instances of Don Quixote's madness are mainly the result of people trying to tell him a version of reality that isn't true, and Don Quixote's only explanation for their story not matching reality is that there must be some enchanters who are creating these differences between the way he sees the world and the others see the world. So in the second novel, I definitely think that there's definitely a lot more to be said for the fact that he's not really crazy, he's just disillusioned, or he's just being manipulated by the people around him. So I think I've given you enough pluses and negatives. I think my overall view is negative just because of the length of it. You know, if we could have reduced this with like if we could have reduced the length of both of these parts by half, I would have enjoyed it a lot more, because I definitely think it does have its merit. The things that I've mentioned in terms of the positivity, the fact that I am able to talk about this book for such a long time and be able to analyze a lot of the content to such an extent means that there is definitely a lot there that can be engaged with. However, a lot of it seems to be weighed down with way too many adventures, that don't necessarily add a whole lot to the overarching goal of this story. So that's kind of going to be my talk on Don Quixote de la Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. I am very happy that I finally got around to reading this one. If you count them together, this would have been the longest book on my shelves for a very long time already. They are very much in any case on the longer scale of what I still had on my physical TBR, and I bought these babies like 11 years ago or something, so I'm so happy that I finally got around to them. I am also very happy that I finally read such an important classic of Spanish literature. As I said, I did study Spanish, and so I was introduced to a lot of those stories, though we really didn't need to read any of the real major classics. I think in our education of Spanish we mainly looked at more modern Spanish works, or we mainly had to read more modern Spanish works, and so I definitely did enjoy diving into one of those classics that I've learned about but that I didn't really dive into fully at that time. And so perhaps I will actually dive into some others, because even though this was way too long for what I got out of it, I do think that, especially when I'm giving you guys this book talk, there was so much there. So I hope that some of the other Spanish classics can also have that same sort of critical engagement experience as I had with Don Quixote. But so yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know down below if you've read Don Quixote, what your thoughts were about it, and if not, whether you're actually interested in it after seeing this video or not. And yeah, we can talk about it further in the comments down below. So hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for a future one. Bye!